At exactly 9:50 a.m. on the 23rd of July, 2025, beneath a cloudless Black Sea sky, a blinding flash tore through the horizon. In less than 5 seconds, Russia's most fortified offshore platform, Boyko Tower Alpha, buckled and collapsed into the sea. The blast melted steel, vaporized concrete, and sent a column of smoke rising over 1,000 meters into the air. No air raid sirens, no missiles. Just one unmanned vessel, a sleek gray shadow skimming the waves unseen, unstoppable. What triggered this catastrophic strike wasn't a multi-million-dollar warhead. It was a drone built in a basement, guided by a laptop, and launched from reeds on the Ukrainian coast. This is not just a story about firepower. It's a blueprint for the next era of naval warfare, and a chilling reminder that the front lines can shift with just a click. And yet, it barely made headlines. Why? What really happened off the coast that morning? And what does it mean for the future of naval warfare? Let's break it down. Don't just watch, engage. If military clarity and truth beneath the headlines matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. The story begins not with the explosion, but with the quiet hum of 4 brushless motors spinning up to 20,000 revolutions per minute. At 8:30 a.m., the 23rd of July, 2025, an SBU operator known only by his call sign Soil sat in a concealed coastal bunker near Snake Island. Through his VR-style FPV goggles, he watched the world from the eyes of a homemade quadcopter just 10 inches across, weighing under 5 kilograms, and carrying a custom-built 3-kilogram explosive charge. Built for under $500, it was a weapon designed not by a defense contractor, but by necessity. His target: the NEVA radar installation atop Boyko Tower Alpha, a massive offshore platform seized by Russian forces early in the war. This radar wasn't ordinary. It could detect targets up to 45 kilometers away, track 200 objects simultaneously, and feed targeting data to missile systems across the northwestern Black Sea. For months, it had been the eyes of Russia's maritime defenses. Soil's mission was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Fly 35 kilometers across open water, staying under 50 meters in altitude, weaving in a zigzag pattern to evade detection, and hit the radar's most vulnerable joint, the connection between antenna and control unit. The drone lifted from a hidden reed bed, skimming low over the waves. Analog video feed kept Soil's control link immune to Russian jamming. The NEVA radar swept methodically, oblivious to the threat, its operators unaware that its tiny radar cross-section made the incoming craft appear no different from a seabird. At 200 meters out, Russian personnel finally noticed, shouting and pointing. One reached for a rifle. Too late. At 9:20, the drone struck dead center on the NEVA's antenna assembly. The explosion was small by military standards, but perfectly placed. Aluminum shrapnel and severed waveguides rained down. The rotating array froze mid-sweep. Russia's eyes over the Black Sea went dark. From that moment, Boyko Tower Alpha was blind, and something far more dangerous was already racing toward it. With the NEVA radar silenced, Boyko Tower Alpha had lost its shield. That's when the second wave began. 30 kilometers out, cutting through the Black Sea swells, a low gray silhouette knifed forward at nearly 50 knots. This was no fishing skiff, no patrol craft. It was a Seababy unmanned surface vessel, USV, Ukraine's purpose-built answer to hardened maritime targets. 6 meters in length, powered by twin 200 horsepower waterjet engines, it was a weapon optimized for speed, stealth, and impact. Its design kept the hull riding low in the water, below most radar horizons, while the muted gray paint blended perfectly with the choppy sea. Hidden beneath the reinforced bow was its heart: 1,000 kilograms of military-grade explosives, arranged in multiple shaped charges. This configuration wasn't about one massive detonation. It was engineered to focus blast energy into structural weak points, triggering a sympathetic chain of secondary charges. The effect was brutally efficient sequential explosions tearing through steel supports and concrete foundations, leaving no chance for partial survival of the target. The warhead's explosive mix, a blend of RDX and TNT, could sustain temperatures over 3,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt load-bearing beams. When applied to an offshore platform's primary supports, the result would be not just damage, but total structural collapse. Navigation was just as advanced as its destructive payload. The Seababy's onboard computer combined GPS, inertial guidance, and encrypted satellite control. Operators could alter its course in real time, adapting to new threats or shifting defensive positions. And if Russian electronic warfare tried to jam the link, the vessel could switch frequencies instantly or even complete its mission autonomously using stored waypoints. For this strike, intelligence teams had mapped every meter of Boyko Tower Alpha, where equipment was stored, where fuel tanks were hidden, where the living quarters met the main structural supports. The mission profile was precise: hit the junction between the accommodation block and the drilling structure. Destroy that, and the entire platform would fold into the sea. With the NEVA radar destroyed, the defenders on Boyko Tower Alpha were suddenly operating in the dark. No early warning screens, no long-range plots of incoming threats, just the naked horizon and a few handheld binoculars. At 9:15, the Seababy was 20 kilometers out. Through its high-definition electro-optical camera, SBU operators on the Ukrainian coast saw the platform grow larger with every wave. The dark plume from the earlier FPV strike still curled into the morning sky, a signal to the drone's human controllers that the first phase of the mission was complete. The approach vector had been calculated with surgical precision. Instead of charging straight in, the Seababy looped wide to the east, using the sun's reflection on the water to make its low profile even harder to detect. At 45 knots, it closed the gap with relentless speed, its autopilot making hundreds of micro-adjustments every second to maintain the optimal strike path. On the platform, the first signs of alarm appeared: small figures moving quickly along the main deck, pointing toward the horizon. One man raised a rifle, another sprinted to a radio shack. But these actions were more symbolic than tactical. The Seababy was built to outrun and outmaneuver any small arms defense. At this range, machine gun bursts would scatter harmlessly into the sea. 15 kilometers out, the drone accelerated to full power, 49 knots, the twin water jets churning white spray behind it. At this speed, the 6-meter vessel weighed little more than a guided freight train aimed directly at the platform's weakest link. Every second shaved off the approach meant fewer opportunities for the defenders to react. 10 kilometers out, the Seababy's targeting system locked onto the structural joint between the accommodation block and the main drilling tower. The targeting reticle on the operator's control screen turned from amber to red. Strike confirmed. 5 kilometers. On deck, Russian personnel were now in full panic, waving and shouting into radios, perhaps calling for air support from the coast, but help was over 100 kilometers away. The only weapons they had were small arms and a handful of light machine guns, none of which could bring down a waterborne target that fast, that low, and that steady. At 2 kilometers, the Seababy's camera feed showed the target filling the frame. The autopilot held course with cold precision, compensating for the chop of the waves and the erratic crosswinds. There would be no evasive maneuvers now, just the final, unstoppable run. Impact was less than a minute away. At 9:50 a.m., the sea erupted. The Seababy slammed into the Boyko Tower Alpha's main structural junction with the precision of a laser-guided weapon and the momentum of a freight train. In that instant, the shaped charges packed into its reinforced bow detonated in perfect sequence. The first blast punched through the steel framework like a hot knife through ice, focusing its energy directly into the load-bearing columns. The secondary charges followed milliseconds later, compounding the destruction, peeling back girders and shredding reinforced concrete. Temperatures at the blast core spiked above 3,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt the hardened steel lattice that anchored the platform to its pylons. The air itself seemed to ignite, a searing orange fireball enveloping the impact zone. From the Ukrainian control station, operators watched the structural integrity crumble in real time. First, the accommodation block, once home to the platform's crew, disintegrated into fragments, its prefabricated walls vaporized by the heat. Then the massive drilling framework began to twist, groaning like a wounded giant as support beams sheared apart. On the deck, chaos reigned. Those close to the impact point simply vanished in the blinding light. Others, stationed further out, stumbled through smoke and debris, desperately searching for stable footing as the structure beneath them shifted and tilted. But the collapse was accelerating, and the platform was no longer a single solid mass. It was becoming a series of disconnected, failing segments. Below deck, the real catastrophe was only beginning. The platform's fuel storage tanks, each holding thousands of liters of diesel for the generators, ruptured one after another. With every tank that gave way, a fresh explosion added to the inferno. Flames roared skyward, feeding on the thick black fuel and licking across the shattered metal like a blowtorch over paper. From a satellite's perspective, the strike zone was now a scar on the sea, a bloom of orange flame at the center, surrounded by expanding rings of dark smoke and debris, and an oily slick stretching with the current. The Boyko Tower Alpha, a structure designed to endure storms and decades of operation, had just been undone in less than 60 seconds. The strike at the Boyko Tower Alpha did not end with the initial blast, it only began there. The platform's architecture, like most offshore installations, was a web of interdependent supports. Remove one critical joint, and the rest began to fail in sequence. The Seababy's detonation had severed precisely that joint. As the accommodation block folded in on itself, its weight dragged down adjoining decks, snapping steel catwalks like brittle twigs. Each collapse fed the next. Storage areas packed with spare parts and heavy machinery crashed into the lower levels, punching holes through plating and rupturing more fuel lines. Secondary explosions rippled outward in staggered intervals, each one sending another surge of heat and force into the already failing structure. Then came the firestorm. Diesel-fed flames wrapped the remaining pylons, their orange glare reflecting off the surrounding waves. The sea itself seemed to shimmer with heat, the surface broken by floating debris and patches of burning fuel. In places, the flames danced directly atop the slick, creating rings of fire on the water. From the horizon, it would have looked like a warship burning a pillar of smoke towering more than 1,000 meters into the cloudless sky. For Russian commanders monitoring the feed from distant outposts, the sight must have been both bewildering and horrifying. Their Black Sea stronghold reduced to an unrecognizable silhouette in minutes. By the 5-minute mark, the Boyko Tower's upper structure was gone. Only twisted stumps of steel jutted from the water, glowing dull red from residual heat. Around them, the shattered remnants of the platform sections of deck plating, collapsed cranes, and scorched containers floated aimlessly on a dark, oil-slicked sea. For the few Russian personnel who had been stationed in the lower levels and somehow survived the blast, survival now meant clinging to unstable wreckage. Rescue was impossible. Helicopters could not land through the heat, shimmer, and smoke, and naval vessels were hours away. The same water that had once been their barrier against attack had become an isolating trap. 2 hours later, a Ukrainian satellite pass captured the aftermath. The Black Sea's surface marred by black plumes and metallic wreckage, the Boyko Tower Alpha's coordinates now marking nothing more than a burning grave in international waters. The second wave of the operation was complete, and yet, the strike's impact, both tactical and symbolic, was only beginning to ripple outward. From Washington to Brussels, the footage of Boyko Tower Alpha's destruction was replayed in classified briefings and secure video conferences. For the United States, the strike was more than a tactical win for Ukraine. It was a live demonstration of how low-cost, precision-guided systems could outmatch traditional defenses in maritime warfare. Analysts at the Pentagon's Office of Naval Intelligence paused on freeze frames of the Seababy's final approach, noting how it exploited radar blind spots and reaction time limitations. The takeaway was clear. Even the most fortified offshore installations were vulnerable if their surveillance assets were neutralized first. In NATO's Maritime Command Center in Northwood, UK, officers overlaid satellite images with known Russian logistics patterns. Boyko Tower Alpha had been a keystone in Russia's Black Sea network, a staging post for resupplying patrol craft, a sensor node for long-range detection, and a hub for coordinating anti-ship missile batteries along the coast. Its loss left a gap in coverage that no replacement could fill quickly. American reconnaissance assets had been watching the region for days prior. A U.S. Air Force RQ-4 Global Hawk had tracked unusual Russian resupply runs to the platform, while a Navy MQ-9B Sea Guardian orbited at altitude to collect signals intelligence. Neither platform engaged directly, but their data feeds gave NATO partners a clear view of the target's defensive readiness or lack thereof. The strike also reinforced a doctrinal shift, long discussed in war colleges. The kill chain no longer required billion-dollar assets to achieve strategic effects. In the case of Boyko Tower Alpha, the kill chain consisted of a $500 FPV drone to blind the target and a purpose-built USV costing a fraction of a missile destroyer's single-weapon loadout. The result was total mission success at a cost measured in tens of thousands of dollars, not millions. Privately, U.S. naval planners began to explore scenarios where Allied forces could deploy similar low-profile USVs in contested waters from the Baltic to the South China Sea, using lessons drawn from the Black Sea. The destruction of Boyko Tower Alpha wasn't just a Ukrainian victory. It was a blueprint for NATO's future littoral strategies. Still, the strike carried risks. Moscow's Black Sea fleet, embarrassed and enraged, might accelerate deployment of counter-USV measures nets, rapid-fire autocannons, or electronic spoofing buoys. The question in every NATO briefing was the same. How far would Russia go to reassert control over waters it now knew were penetrable? In the hours after the strike, Moscow's official statements were muted, an unusual pause in a conflict where propaganda usually moved faster than facts. State media referred to a localized fire on a civilian energy platform and avoided mentioning the loss of the NEVA radar. But in military circles, the gravity of the blow was unmistakable. Boyko Tower Alpha had been more than steel and concrete. It had been a symbol of Russia's enduring hold over the northwestern Black Sea. Now it was gone. Ukraine's leadership seized the moment. In a late-night address, the president called the strike a turning point in maritime security, framing it not as an escalation, but as the removal of an illegal military foothold in occupied waters. Kyiv's message to both domestic and international audiences was clear. Ukraine could and would dismantle Russian infrastructure far beyond the front lines. From Brussels, NATO officials publicly praised Ukraine's defensive ingenuity while privately cautioning member states about the risks of further escalation. Intelligence assessments warned that Russia might respond by intensifying naval patrols or deploying additional missile batteries along Crimea's coastline. Some analysts even floated the possibility of Russian submarine activity increasing in the Bosporus approach as a move that would alarm Turkey and test the Montreux Convention. In Washington, the National Security Council debated the broader implications. The strike had demonstrated how Allied intelligence sharing could enable precision attacks without direct NATO involvement, a model that could be replicated in other contested regions. But it also raised the specter of Russia accelerating its own unmanned systems programs, potentially targeting offshore energy infrastructure in the North Sea or Mediterranean as retaliation. Internationally, the reaction was mixed. Baltic states, already wary of Russian naval maneuvers, saw the operation as proof that small, agile systems could offset numerical disadvantages. Meanwhile, some Western European leaders urged restraint, worried about the precedent of targeting offshore energy assets, even those used for military purposes. The economic ripples were immediate. Shipping insurers raised premiums for routes passing within 100 kilometers of Crimea, and energy analysts began recalculating the security costs of offshore platforms worldwide. In the private sector, defense contractors specializing in counter-drone technologies reported a surge in inquiries. The Black Sea itself had changed. Without Boyko Tower Alpha's surveillance reach, Ukrainian vessels, both military and civilian, would have more room to maneuver. But the same waters could now become a testing ground for Russia's countermeasures. The strike was not just an end. It was the opening move in a new phase of the maritime conflict, one defined by innovation, unpredictability, and the constant shadow of escalation. By the evening of the 23rd of July, 2025, the Boyko Tower Alpha was no longer a fortress. It was a ghost, its skeletal remains jutting from the Black Sea like the ribs of a shipwreck, surrounded by a shimmering halo of oil and fire. The images captured from orbit told a story more powerful than any statement. A multi-level offshore base, once critical to Russian surveillance and logistics, erased in under an hour by two unmanned systems working in sequence. No destroyers, no airstrikes, just precision, planning, and a deep understanding of the target's vulnerabilities. For Ukraine, the strike was a strategic and symbolic victory, proving that innovation could overcome scale. For Russia, it was a harsh reminder that even the most fortified positions were not untouchable. And for NATO, it was a case study in how small, relatively inexpensive platforms could achieve results once reserved for high-cost, high-risk operations. But the larger question remains, what happens when this playbook is used elsewhere against oil platforms in contested waters or naval bases in distant seas? The same technologies that made Boyko Tower Alpha fall could be adapted, replicated, and turned against almost any fixed maritime asset in the world. The Black Sea may be calmer tonight, but beneath the surface, the currents of escalation are already shifting. If you followed this story to the end, ask yourself, was this the future of naval warfare arriving early, or just the opening act of something far larger? If military clarity and truth beneath the headlines matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and share your perspective in the comments. Your voice fuels our mission to deliver the untold stories shaping our world. Next time, we'll examine how U.S. destroyers are adapting to counter unmanned threats both above and below the waterline.